Welcome back to the show. Today, I am joined by Cody Moxley. Cody, thank you for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, dude. So, for the listeners who might not know, will you give us a quick background on who you are and what you're up to right now?
Yeah, so I'm one of the coaches for N1 Education, along with Coach Cassim and Coach Cassim Hansen and Coach Adam Miller, and we kind of focus on online education for trainers, but we also kind of do on our social media some kind of more applicable tips and things for people who are just enjoy training, want to be safe, want to have long-term consistent progress. So we focus on everything from biomechanics to advanced nutrition and stuff.
Perfect. And again, like we were talking about off air here, in one, just such helpful education for any trainer, any coach, or just anyone that's trying to make their training more effective. I can't recommend enough to check out all you guys' content. So I'd like to dive into your backstory a little bit before we get too deep into exercise selection, resistance profiles, things like that, like we were talking about. What brought you here? How did you link up with N1, or how did that come about?
Yeah, so mine, it was definitely not a direct path, I'll tell you that. Probably it was around like 2010 when I was in school. I just kind of started really getting into fitness. My formal education background is accounting and finance. So I'm
Okay.
a detail analytics numbers type of guy. So that was what I was looking for when I started getting into fitness. I was, kind of like everyone who starts out, I was looking for the answer. What's the right number of sets? How many reps? Like resistance, like rest
Right.
time, like how many
Right.
days a week, all that stuff. And just getting deeper and deeper into it, you start realizing it's like there's no magic program, there's no magic pill, but there are kind of foundational principles that need to be applied that are going to make you better regardless of what you're doing.
Right.
So I kind of pursued just a lot of self-taught stuff until I eventually was offered a job after graduating to move down to Tampa to run like the online side of a fitness business based out of a gym down there.
Okay.
And that was actually where I met Coach Cassim and Coach Adam. And after a couple of years, Cassim decided he wanted to get more into the advanced education side of things and teaching the things that we were kind of learning and that he was coming up with. So started N1, moved to Colorado, and we've been here for about 2.5 years now, traveled through the UK, Australia, Canada, teaching like 3-day practicals. And then we have our online courses and stuff. So just kind of a whirlwind of the last couple of years of just learning, kind of hoarding all the courses and education material we can get our hands on, and going through like, even if we're not like trying to learn from it necessarily, we're trying to learn what is being taught in the industry, so we know what kind of topics we should cover, the language that people are using, and then just trying to stay on top of like what's current with research and stuff. So
I love it. I love it. So it sounds like you have a pretty extensive background as an online coach as well. Is that true?
I guess that depends who I'm being compared to. I've probably done online coaching myself about the last 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
The majority of it with N1. Before that, I was mainly focused on, I was like the project management, articles and stuff like that. But yeah, the online coaching stuff has really been about probably the last 4 years.
Okay. Okay. Right on. Right on. Cool. So biggest reason I wanted to have you on, man, like we were talking about, and one just has such good content when we're talking about like exercise selection. And really, I think that a big missing piece for many within their training is kind of understanding the why behind the exercises they're actually implementing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to make this episode a deep dive into that. So before we get too deep into like, hey, here's the exercises you could choose, or like a smart exercises to implement in different situations, would you give us a quick overview of strength profiles, resistance profiles, whichever you want to start with, because I know this is a pretty broad topic, but just a quick overview of those two topics, and then explain like kind of why those are important for the listener to understand.
Sure. So first would probably be best to just talk about what a resistance profile is, because that's can be a very strange term for someone who's not familiar with this stuff, right?
Right.
So the very simple explanation, I guess, would be it's if you were to graph the relative challenge of an exercise throughout its range of motion. So if we take a simple example of like a squat, again, this can be kind of hard on a podcast because I can't draw stuff. But if you just kind of visualize a graph going from shortened to lengthened, that graph is going to be, you know, highest in that position, the lengthened position, which would be the bottom of the squat where the quads and glutes are lengthened. And then that resistance drops off significantly as you get to the short position when you're, you know, standing upright and your joints are stacked and everything.
Right.
So that's the simple explanation of a resistance profile.
Okay. Okay. So then so can you give an example of like a couple different movements where we see like, okay, this is how the resistance profile is changing across the movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we look at, let's say like a dumbbell fly, it's going to look very similar to a squat, right? When your arms are extended in that bottom position, very, very challenging. And then it drops off. It becomes like hardly challenging at all when you're at that very top position. There's really no resistance left.
Okay.
So that would be like a lengthened biased, what we call a lengthened overloaded resistance profile.
Right.
And if we were to do kind of the opposite of that, might be a cable fly where you're standing like between the like the cable jungle setup with the wide pulleys. And when you go to that short position, the cables are, you know, basically 90 degrees to your forearm, and it's overloaded in that short position. So that's where all the load is. And then, you know, as you go to that lengthened position, there's really no load, essentially, depending on how you're set up, of course.
Right.
And then maybe like a mid-range resistance profile might be just like a standing dumbbell curl, right? So it's like as you come halfway up, once your forearm's parallel to the ground, that's technically where it's going to be most challenging or overloaded. And then it will drop off as you go in either direction, up or down.
Right. Okay. Okay. So in simplest terms, we could basically say a resistance profile is just how the difficulty of the exercise changes across the movement. And that is very,
Yep.
very simplified, but perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. Or just where it's just a way of putting into words where the exercise is most challenging.
Right. But I know the first time like I even started to understand this concept, it's like, oh shit, like that's okay. So a dumbbell fly is a completely different movement than a cable fly from this perspective, which I think is again like important for people to understand. So then diving into strength profiles, can you explain what this is to us?
Yep. So kind of a similar concept. It's we're putting into words the ability of a muscle to produce force throughout its entire contractile range. So when that muscle is fully lengthened versus fully shortened, and just trying to describe how that would look if we graphed it. So generally speaking, muscles are going to have their greatest ability to produce force somewhere in their mid-range or their mid-length. And then it will drop off as we get to fully shortened or fully lengthened. The tricky part is, and this is kind of going towards the more advanced side, is depending on the type of muscle tissue, that curve, that graph is going to shift one direction or the other.
Right.
But I think the important thing about strength profiles for people to understand is we're not just looking only at a muscle in isolation, because all of our muscles are acting on a joint, right? So what we're really concerned with is kind of what we refer to as like the force profile, which is what's your ability to produce force in that muscle on the joint that it's acting on, right?
Right.
So again, it's not something that I don't think people need to get too overly analytical with, because I think for the most part, if you just you try to figure out how this matches up in a particular exercise, so we'll do a rep, right? You can pretty quickly figure out like where is the exercise most challenging.
Right.
Okay, I have my answer. I don't need to try and figure out, all right, like, so if the insertion point is this far from the joint and the muscle's at this length, it's like, you don't need to worry about any of that.
Right.
It's like, do a rep, you can probably figure it out, and then we'll work forward from there.
Okay. Okay. So then taking all this into exercise selection, like how does this actually apply to, okay, I'm choosing better or worse movements for my goals?
Mm-hmm. Well, so the big thing is there's not like a magic resistance profile either, just like there's not a magic exercise, right?
Right.
So I think a common misconception is people try to look for like, what's the exercise that best matches the strength profile is a thing I've heard a lot, right?
Right.
I was like, how do I make this exercise as hard as possible throughout the entire range of motion? And that's, quote unquote, the most efficient exercise. Well, that's not necessarily true, because, depending on the goal of the training, or as we talk about the stimulus of the training, what we're trying to achieve in the session, a different resistance profile might be better or worse.
Right.
So a simple example, like if we look at mechanical damage is one of our like stimuli that we refer to. Well, if we're trying to achieve mechanical damage, most often we're going to want to train something that's maybe overloaded in the lengthened position as opposed to the shortened position. And then conversely, if we're doing a lot of like local or like a lot of metabolic type training where we want to be able to train frequently and recover quickly,
Right.
then maybe choosing things that are more biased towards that short position, both from an exercise perspective and the muscle length itself, is going to be more congruent to that goal. So you have to be able to understand what your goal is first before we can pick the exercises that are going to match that.
Okay. Okay. And I know, speaking to what you were talking about earlier, when I first understood like this, or somewhat understood this concept, I know for me it was like, okay, I always have to choose movements that, like you said, where the resistance profile matches the force profile or the strength profile. So like, why would I ever do anything outside of like a stepped back single arm hammer strength row, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like, why would I ever not use like bands on the leg press or bands on the hack squat? So do you feel like generally, again, like if we're looking at, so let's use like bands on the leg press, or let's use bands on the hack squat as a good example of this. Is that something like, why would we not implement that, for example? Because we know, okay, this is going to, like, the top half of the movement is, in simplest terms, is going to be a lot easier. So if I'm banding this, then it's going to challenge the muscle through a fuller range of motion or create more overload through the top half, right? So like we're saying, like, if I have for hypertrophy, our goal is to create as much tension through the entire rep as possible. Why would we not do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of this is going to start to get into kind of the more advanced volume discussion. But if we're looking at the same exercise and changing the resistance profile, a more, matched resistance profile is technically going to be more muscular work than one that is biased to a very small portion of the range, right? So, a reverse banded hack squat is going to be technically more volume for the same number of reps to failure than just a regular hack squat.
Right.
So we can use that either. I mean, there's a bunch of methods we could use depending on what, again, it comes back to what stimulus we're trying to train. So if we're going for, let's say, like a neurological goal of, I want to work on my starting strength or my ability to initiate forcefully out of the lengthened position. So something that powerlifters are very concerned with, right? For example,
Right.
having that just regular hack squat might be good because we want to be able to generate some momentum on that concentric, right? Our goal is just overload that bottom position, explode, and then try and essentially reduce the work by creating a little bit of momentum. However, if we're going into more of like a hypertrophy type of stimulus, where we're trying to maximize the amount of high intensity work that we can do, then that banded might be a little more helpful in some situations because we're getting more work through the range, but it's not basically crushing us so much in the bottom that we're going to get stuck there necessarily. So it can deload it enough that maybe the overload point is just past that bottom range. And then you have the considerations of like how heavy the load is. Deloading can actually decrease some of the eccentric momentum, which can in some cases be a little safer, especially like in a hack squat where you don't want to get pushed out of your active range and possibly injure yourself. So it can just assist with control of the movement. So, I mean, there's a myriad of possibilities, right?
Right.
And then, I mean, another example, if we're doing, when you get into looking at the different types of supersets you can do for different goals. So like doing a short lengthened superset. So doing like a leg extension and a hack squat, we're training the same muscle, but we kind of want going back to resistance profiles, we kind of want almost opposite or complementary resistance profiles in that case. So, I mean, if we were to get into, all the different types of supersets, then we could start playing around with like, all right, well, what if we did a banded one here and then a short over here and a lengthened over here? So.
Okay. So my question then is, do you feel like, again, like if we're talking about like implementing the bands for hypertrophy purpose, is that something that you ever see getting taken like too far? Like, hey, we don't need to throw bands on everything, or do you feel like it, for the most part, makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, that comes down to the exercise, I guess. So like if you look at certain machines, like the hammer strength row that you gave the example of, it's like there's probably not much application for banding that, because when we do that adjustment of like the stepped back, we're wanting it to kind of drop off in the short position, and the band is only going to increase the load in that short position. So it might make it less favorable depending on what we're going for.
Right.
And then there's some exercises where it's just not feasible to create as much of a change. So like a smaller range of motion, because the resistance that the bands are creating or deloading changes, like it's not linear, right? So the further you stretch it, the faster that resistance from the band changes. So if you're doing like a banded barbell press, it's not a huge range of motion. So if you have tension from the beginning, it's probably not overloading very much when you're doing that rep. Now, of course, the exception would be if you're doing, speed work, then that's another story. But if you're trying to do hypertrophy based stuff, probably like a banded barbell bench press isn't the best use of a band.
Right.
So they'll typically work better when you have a larger range of motion that band can actually act on. So like you gave the hack squat is a perfect example that we'll use fairly regularly.
Okay, perfect. I feel like that's super applicable. So then when we're looking at, okay, we have these movements that overload things in the shortened, lengthened, or mid-range, are you trying to like spread that across the week? So, hey, we want to make sure we've taken like shortened, lengthened, mid-range, we've chosen an exercise that hits each of those like across the course of the week, or how do you go about like setting that up?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we look at the course of like a long-term program, it is going to be important to train everywhere from the fully lengthened to the fully shortened position at some point. But depending on the specific stimulus of the program that we're doing, or I guess one of the common terms is like a mesocycle, right? You don't necessarily have to train every portion of the range every single week, every time you rotate through a program. So for example, like if I'm doing a neurological starting strength program, it's like I just might be overloaded lengthened. Like I'll do 8 sets of squats and maybe that's it. That's all my nervous system needed. It's not like I'm going to lose the ability to contract in the short position if I don't do a leg extension for 4 to 6 weeks.
Right.
But if we're looking more towards like the hypertrophy side of things, we are going to want to try and get as much tension through as much range of motion as possible. So part of that will be, I mean, for most muscle groups, you can pretty much get it done with 2 exercises. If you were just choosing complementary resistance profiles, like one shortened, one lengthened, or, muscle length shortened and lengthened. Exception being when we have multiple division muscles like the pecs and the lats, right? So if you wanted to emphasize each division individually, then your exercise selection goes up. But even with those, we have to keep in mind there's going to be overlap. So I know I kind of got off a little bit off topic there, but I think I just want to touch on the different divisions thing really quickly, because that's a question I've had from like some of the coaches that I mentor is like, well, do I need like a shortened and lengthened for all 3 all 3 main divisions? I'm like, no, you don't. Right? Because it's like if you're doing a sternal, so the middle division of the pec press,
right,
you're still getting some work and some tension in the other division. There's overlap. It's just not as biased to those other divisions, right?
Right.
So maybe you do the majority of like sternal and some costal, because those kind of have the most different arm paths. And maybe you do, one set for clavicular if you need to bias that. Same thing for lats. It's like you don't need 3 exercises to hit, thoracic, lumbar, and iliac divisions of the lats. Probably a pull down in a row. Most likely you're good.
Right. Okay. Okay. So then you're saying basically across a training week, or like furthermore across the mesocycle, you would just make sure, like, again, so can you give a specific example actually? So let's say chest and lats specifically, because that's something you touched on. So like across a training week, then what would your exercise selection look like? So to know like, hey, we've probably ticked all these boxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
I know it's going to depend again on the goal, but
yeah, I mean, if we're just choosing to make sure that we're training all of those divisions throughout the majority of the range of motion, most often I will have like a costal cable fly in there, just because costal presses don't typically fit most people very well because of the internal rotation required. Um, but a dip can be another good costal pec movement. So dip or costal fly, depending on what you have available. And then usually some kind of sternal or slight incline press or fly movement. Um, if you hit kind of a slightly inclined press or fly and a costal fly or a dip, you're pretty much getting most of the range or most of the divisions covered. It just is going to depend on how many sets, how much volume, how many reps you're doing based on what the goal of that particular training cycle is.
okay. Okay. And then similarly, if like for lats, how do you go about that across the course of a week?
Yeah, so I mean, most of that I can get done in one workout, because 2 to 3 exercises pretty much does it. So personally, I really like for the lower outer division, which is the iliac division of the lats. If you have a hammer row, doing the kneeling single arm hammer row pull down is a really good option, because it's more overloaded in that lengthened position that you really can't get with a cable machine or most other machines that you have.
Right.
Um, and then some sort of row. So I really like chest supported rows, just because it takes out the additional stability of the spine and pelvis required from doing like a cable row. And usually I like to have people do that with a slight lean forwards. If we're doing a machine, trying to line up kind of the middle division of the lats, which is the lumbar division. And if you have, so you can achieve that either with like a seated cable row or like the stepped back hammer row option. I'm not a fan of dumbbell rows for lats specifically. I
Okay.
do like them for upper back and rear delts, but I don't really like them for lats, just because the range of motion that actually has significant tension in them is so small that you're really not getting a tremendous amount of work done for the majority of the range of motion.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And again, like we talked about, a lot very counter to like what you'll commonly see put out there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So then you've touched on a couple times, like it very much depends on the stimuli that we're trying to apply within like this mesocycle. Do you mind, and if it's not too much to ask, going through like for someone that's focused on hypertrophy, it sounds like you guys kind of like phase these different stimuli, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Would you mind just giving us a brief overview of like what does that typically look like?
Yeah. So just, I guess, to clarify, when I say stimuli or stimulus, I'm just referring to what it takes in our training session to create an adaptive response from our body for a particular characteristic. So hypertrophy is an outcome. It's not technically a stimulus, but there are multiple stimuli that can contribute to hypertrophy,
Okay.
right? So when we look at hypertrophy, kind of the stimuli we break it down into is going to be mechanical damage, sarcoplasmic, which is kind of your common, super lots of pump, high reps type of stuff.
Right.
It's the skin splitting pump that everyone loves.
Right.
Um, Mechanical tension, what we call it mechanotransduction. That refers specifically to the tension in a muscle fiber. We like our nerdy scientific terms, so we call it mechanotransduction. And those are kind of going to be the main three.
Right.
When we go more towards the metabolic side, we have some oxidative damage stuff as well. But probably the three most common are going to be the mechanical tension, mechanical damage, and sarcoplasmic. The important thing to understand for the listeners, if you want to get into this stuff, is that you're never truly isolating to just one. There's always some degree of overlap. So we're just trying to pick our exercise selection and our training variables to bias it as much to one of those as possible, so that throughout our periodization, we can switch between them without basically hammering the same, pathways over and over and over again, that your body will basically builds up a tolerance to, or it is no longer able to adapt as quickly to. So that's where we work in the periodization of, like, once we tap this one stimulus, we've kind of hit our threshold for adaptation, we'll switch to another one. And then basically the threshold for that comes down, so we can switch back, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So the mechanical damage one, like I touched on, is exactly what it sounds. A lot of people are familiar with this one. It's just creating micro trauma in the muscle tissue itself. The mechanical tension or mechanotransduction refers specifically to the tension in a individual muscle fiber, not the total amount of tension in the muscle tissue itself. So tendon to tendon tension. So that's an important thing to understand when we start looking at how to program for these, because with mechanical tension, you can achieve it anywhere from working with high intensity stuff to more fatigue based stuff. Right.
Okay.
So there's a spectrum that we can program a lot of these different stimuli on. And that's stuff that we really get into in detail with, examples and walkthroughs of, example programs and things in the online courses. That's why it's like 25 hours long, like no joke, because there's a lot to go over.
Right.
So this is just the tip of the iceberg that we'll probably, be into today when it comes to stimuli stuff. But yeah, if your coaches are really interested, that's the way to go, because I can't cover all this stuff in an hour. Yeah. And then the sarcoplasmic is just a combination of like local metabolic work with that mechanotransduction component. So when people talk about, I'm sure you've seen, like, talk about, well, mechanical damage isn't a stimulus, it's a byproduct of work or tension.
Right.
Yes and no, because again, this is more in the core stuff, but there's cellular biological adaptations that occur with mechanical damage that you don't necessarily get to the same degree with other hypertrophy stimuli. So each of these also have, cellular benefits that contribute to long-term growth.
Right.
So it's important to not just try and hammer one particular type of hypertrophy or one type of hypertrophy workout only. You need a blend of all of these things if you want to have the fastest long-term progress, joint health, function, mobility, range of motion, all of these things.
That is super insightful, because I know you had, I think it was Brad Schoenfield I originally heard, you had the 3 M's of hypertrophy, right? And then muscle damage, I know for the longest time or mechanical damage, muscle damage. I don't know if are those interchangeable?
Pretty much.
Okay. But that was for the longest time, that was like, oh, that shit really doesn't matter. Like, we don't need to pay attention to that. It's all about mechanical tension, you hear people say, right? But very much like there are all these different factors that play into that. So that's super insightful. So just touching on periodization real quick, then with these 3 different factors, how do you go about like kind of rotating them across like the bigger picture of a training program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the biggest thing we look at when we're like periodizing for clients is, the first thing we try and figure out is what's their limiting factor, what's the weak link, and then we try and work on that first. So that just plays into this concept we talk about called potentiation, which just means I'm going to work on something now that's going to make me either perform or recover better later in a different type of training.
Right.
Right. So if someone comes in and they just they can't rest less than like a minute and a half between sets, or they're huffing and puffing, between squats or whatever. It's like, okay, well, we probably need to work on some like conditioning work,
Right.
right? Because if we want to do more sets or higher reps, your cardiovascular system is going to be the limiting factor before your muscle tissue is. So we're not going to get the amount of, tissue level stimulus and work that we need before you're just exhausted, right? So we're always looking for what's the limiting factor. So again, with the hypertrophy thing, it's not always just hammering different hypertrophy stimuli necessarily. We might, deload from a high volume, tension program. It's like, all right, we're going to do 2 weeks of systemic work and a week of local metabolic work. And then we're probably ready to come back and, oh, look at that. You're recovering faster between sets. You're not sore as long. Your sleep's better. Like all these different things kind of play a role in one another.
Right.
That goes, the same for any goal, even like fat loss stuff. It's like, I'll have a fat loss client and put them on a neurological, like a strength type program for 2 to 3 weeks. And they're like, why are we doing this? And then I explain it to them, and then they do it. And they're like actually getting leaner during the neurological work. It's like, yeah, we took a little bit of a break from, hammering all this, lactate production and, all that system, metabolic stress. And it's like, oh, your system calmed down, you're adapting, you're sleeping better, you're recovering. So.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. So is there a common then, like a new client comes in, is there a most common, hey, this is your weak point, this is what we really need to focus on?
So most often the first thing I will do is put them on a program that is what they were not just doing.
Okay.
Is the simplest thing, right? So I have someone who comes in, it's like, oh, I've been doing, this hypertrophy program for like the last 8 weeks. Like, okay, well, we're not going to be doing that first. We're going to do something else. But I like to try and choose or try and create a type of program that allows me to find kind of their baseline, right?
Okay.
So typically that is going to be, one example would be like a local metabolic program. We like to use the incomplete rest method. I'm not sure if maybe you're familiar with that or not. But basically we choose kind of like a submaximal load, take very short rest periods, and basically allow the fatigue from the short rest periods to build up to failure on a final set.
Okay.
So like probably one of the most popular is like the Vince Gironda method, the 8x8 with 30 seconds rest.
Right.
Right. So that it works really well. It doesn't tend to cause, a lot of inflammation or muscle damage or neurological fatigue or any of that stuff. But it allows you to, create some nutrient partitioning effects, so they can eat more carbs, they can have more glucose. They feel full, they get a pump, they tend to enjoy it. It's efficient, especially if you have someone who is busy and doesn't have a lot of time to train. Works really well because I can get half the body done in like 30 minutes.
Right.
But because it doesn't create a lot of outside stressors, like the neurological and other things, it allows me to understand kind of how their body just responds at maintenance without adding those stresses on top of them, which then gives me a baseline to work from when I start putting them in more stressful stimuli or training situations. It's like, okay, your sleep was fine last week. We started doing this and now you're having trouble falling asleep. Okay, what's going on there? What changed? So that's, I think, the most important thing is finding their baseline, rather than just like, oh, you want to do hypertrophy. All right, here's a hypertrophy program. And it's like, well, my sleep is this, my digestion is this, my energy is this. It's like, okay, well, is that better or worse than it was before? I don't really know.
Right.
So either like that type of program or like a neurological program. If they've been doing a lot of metabolic work, maybe you have a fat loss client who's been doing circuit training for the last 3 months, or Orange Theory or whatever, put them on a neurological workout. It's like, all right, we're going to do like sets of 4 to 6. You got 2 minutes of rest. We're only doing like 2 exercises, and just see if, sometimes maybe they were inflamed from all their metabolic work. It's like, you start seeing that come down, like, I'm losing weight, I'm looking better. And it's like, we haven't even dropped any calories. Most often I give them more calories to start out with. So, I mean, you'll see a lot of that kind of stuff when you just basically deload them from what they were doing, get that assessment, and then we can start looking at, okay, were there any limiting factors in that program? Was the incomplete rest method, did they fail earlier than I thought they should have? all right, well, maybe that's something we need to work on before we put you into a, a hypertrophy program of some sort. So
Okay.
finding that baseline is, pretty important.
Okay. Okay. That makes complete sense. And are these mostly clients you're working with online, or is this more people you see potentially in person?
So this is all online clients,
Okay.
right? Which in some instances can be more challenging than in-person clients because you can't observe their training session,
Right.
right? So they can send you execution videos and stuff, but there's just things that you can't quite do that you can in person. So in some sense, it's almost more challenging to be really good at online coaching.
I agree. Okay. So selfishly then, what biofeedback or like what metrics are you having them track? What are you really focusing on within like check-ins, daily trackers, things like that to make sure you can actually accurately gauge all of this?
Right. Yeah. So first thing I always have, my weekly check-in pictures, same conditions every week. I'm also looking at sleep quality, digestion, energy levels throughout the day, during the training session, pumps. Um, those are kind of the main things I'll start with because I like to have the questionnaire as short as possible, to keep compliance up. So it's like, oh, it takes me 15 seconds to answer this rather than
Right.
40 questions that takes me half an hour to get through, right? So if I have those and it's all pretty simple, it's like drop down stuff and I'll have
Okay.
like 4 or 5 possible answers. And based on what they respond, it will kind of cue me as like, oh, that's a red flag. I need to ask more questions about that. Or like this changed in this way. They started dropping off earlier, or their sleep changed in this specific manner. Okay, that indicates this to me.
Right.
So a lot of it is subjective stuff, which is, like I said, it's more just looking for what are the cues to me that I need to dive deeper into something. And then on their end, it's just kind of very basic, like track your weights in your workouts, track where you're failing, track the progressions. Are they able to achieve the progressions that I have written for them in their program? Because that can indicate to me, okay, was the volume too much? Was the nutrition not enough? All of those types of things. Because after working with them for a little while, you kind of get a pretty good idea of what they should be able to adapt to,
Right.
from week to week. So
Okay. Okay. Perfect. That's super insightful. And again, more of a selfish question than anything else. So then taking this back to exercise selection, across these different, okay, we're chasing this stimulus or we're chasing this stimulus, how often are, so again, let's say we're transitioning from a mechanical damage focus to a mechanical tension focus. Do you have a specific, like, hey, we don't want to rotate that many exercises, or maybe we're going to plug in a lot of new exercises? It's probably it depends answer, but I'd love your take on that.
yeah, actually, I try to keep the number of exercises for a person relatively limited. So usually within the first probably 3 programs, we've probably used all of the exercises that we'll need to use in the future.
Right.
Again, because it's going to depend on what they actually have available. It's like if you only have these machines or these exercises available, well, that's what we have to work with. But I mean, if we were just to say, I have everything available to me, I like to keep it limited because one, it's easier for them to track their progressions rather than trying to figure out, well, I did this on, a flat-footed hip dominant squat, but now we're doing a heel elevated quad dominant squat. How does that change my loading? Or I'm switching from a barbell squat to a hack squat. Like, how can I just move the weights over? It doesn't quite work like that. So I want them to be able to choose their starting weights easily,
Right.
because then there's more time we can spend actually working on the stimulus rather than trying to figure out the weight selection, right? Because like I'm sure is like when you first start that new program, that first time through is like I'm just trying to figure out what load I need to use
Right.
most of the
Exactly.
time, right? So I try to keep the exercise selection limited but as effective as possible. So I'll kind of choose, similar exercises, but I won't give them like, you're not going to have like 18 arm, like bicep exercise, elbow flexion exercise. It's like, we might only need like 4, right? Or
Right.
it'll be something similar enough that you can kind of guess what your weight should be based on, the variables that we're doing for that workout.
Right. Okay. Okay. That makes complete sense. I know For like towards the beginning of starting online coaching, I felt like my job as a coach was, okay, if I don't hit a client with like completely new movements for every single, like most every movement pattern, then they're gonna get bored and they're gonna like. But really, I think that was like one of the most ineffective things I could have been doing, because like you said, like especially if we're just running, like at the time I was also just running 4-week mesocycles with clients, so we have like an intro week. Okay, not really that effective of training, right? If they're deloading at the end of the 4 weeks, again, not really that effective of training. So basically for like every 4-week block, we're maybe getting 2 weeks of, that's
Yeah.
what I even had. Like I've had a couple clients where I got a good amount of pushback, like, hey, why aren't we changing shit up so much? Or like, I really like these 4-week mesocycles and then deloading. It's like, hey, like this is literally like, you're getting like less than half of what you could be getting out of this by us changing things out so often. So I think that's a super important thing for like both coaches and clients to understand.
Yeah. Well, and two, I mean, at N1, we probably change at least programs more frequently than a lot of people do. But because we maintain that consistency and we try to do a good job of educating our clients on how their weights should change and like what to expect, it's not as much of a an obstacle for them. So I mean, like that local metabolic program I talked about for like a new client or something with the incomplete rest method, that's maybe like 2 weeks,
Right.
and then we're moving on. But because I know or I understand the relationship of the loads they should be using, I
Right.
can tell them for the next program, like, okay, remember the loads you used for that? Okay, it's probably going to be, X% more or less than that for this superset that we're doing, for example. So we can give them reference points if we know the stimuli that we're doing. And this is why I pretty much never write a program for someone that I haven't done something similar myself, as far as like the superset setup or the, exercise pairings and rest periods and stuff. Cause the more we experience as coaches, the easier it is to relay and educate to clients, like, here's what to expect in this program. Right. But like you said, with, the 1 week intro and 2 weeks of work and then a deload, it's like, our goal isn't, primary goal anyway, is not to entertain them with a workout. It's to
Right.
get the results, right? And I've never had a person who's been getting results and complained of being bored.
Right.
Like, you're getting them results, they could care less what they're actually doing in the gym if it's working for the most part, right?
Right. Right. No, I couldn't agree more, man. I think, and again, a lot of coaches do listen to the show, so I think that will really speak to a lot of the audience. And again, I know I felt so much pressure when which I was very much like self-imposed, but it was like, I just got to entertain these people, but like you said, I think the biggest piece of getting buy-in from clients is just actually helping them achieve results.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. All of this has been super insightful, man. As far as like all of this relationship between exercise selection, resistance profiles, strength profiles, is there anything else that you feel like you didn't touch on that you would like to go over, or do you feel like we pretty much hit on everything?
I think we did a pretty good job covering just kind of an intro to the basics. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance and stuff that we could get into here, um, but some of it's going to require, a little like background information, some
Right.
functional anatomy and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think if just understanding what a resistant profile is, that you don't have to try and match the resistance of the exercise to a strength profile in every exercise you do.
Right.
And then understanding just the importance of rotating between different types of training to bring up the areas that you're weak in is ultimately going to lead to better long-term progress in your primary goal, whether that's hypertrophy or fat loss or even strength.
I love it. I love it. So I want to be super respectful of your time, man. But before I let you go, we just put out there where people can find you and anything at all you'd like to plug.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, my Instagram is at CJ Moxley. If you want to follow the N1 education stuff, you enjoy like our exercise tips and things, that's n1.education and n1.training on Instagram. And the websites are exactly the same. They're not .com. It's n1.education and n1.training. So we put a ton of free stuff up on those Instagrams every day. And then the member site, N1 training site, has I think 200 free articles and videos already in there.
On in there.
And We have a free membership right now because like half of the people are in lockdown, maybe training at home. We have a free quarantine membership. So if you guys want to take advantage of that, there's, I think, 2 or 3 home workouts we wrote for those people that want to get that free membership. And it also unlocks, I think, like 100 exercises in the exercise library for you too. So I'm just trying to help as many as people as we can, first and foremost.
Perfect. And again, I can't speak to enough how helpful all that has been for me personally. I'll make sure I link up all that in the show notes. Again, thank you for being here, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, really appreciated jumping on and talking with you.
Yep.